Well, welcome back. Today, I am so excited. We have an author, we have an innovator, we have a leader in the field of psychology and gaming addiction. He's also been on TV, and let's dive right in after we look at his bio. This is Dr. Nicholas Kardaras. He is an Ivy League educated psychologist, a best-selling author, and one of the country's foremost experts on mental health, addiction, and the clinical and social impacts of the digital age. He is the founder and chief clinical officer of Omega Recovery in Austin, Texas, and a clinical professor of Stony Brook Medicine, where he specializes in teaching the treatments of addiction and mental health. He's also a co-founder and the chief clinical officer of Blue Light Health, a new online treatment platform for teens struggling with mental health and screen overuse. Dr. Kardaras is the author of the best-selling Glow Kids, which has been translated to 15 languages, and the more recent Digital Madness: How Social Media is Driving Our Mental Health Crisis. He's appeared on ABC's 2020, The Dr. Phil Show, Good Morning America, the CBS Evening News, CNN, Fox and Friends, NPR, PBS, and the BBC. He was also featured on the A&E TV series Digital Addiction and the documentary series Screened Out and Doom Scroll. Dr. Kardaras also worked with both state legislators and members of Congress to help enact digital media legislation to protect children and teens. Wow. Let's meet Dr. Kardaras. This is amazing.
Well, yeah, as my mom used to say, that and the $1.50 gets you on the subway. But I appreciate you reading all the nice bona fides. And Dr. Doan, it is so nice to be connecting with you once again, because I am one of your biggest fans as well. I love what you're doing, and I've respected you for so long. So good to connect with you again.
Likewise, and the respect is mutual. So in your book and in many of your writings and even your videos, you've called this a digital addiction, the new heroin, and warned that screens rewiring young minds in ways we don't fully understand. How serious this crisis is, number one, and what is the stake for the next generation of kids?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first shots across the bow that we started seeing were clinical symptoms. We started seeing all the telltale signs of all the diagnostic symptoms of any kind of an addictive disorder. With substance addiction, we started seeing, cravings and withdrawal and all those things that we were seeing with substance addiction. But I think what really blew this wide open was the neuroimaging, the MRI research that was really showing how it was impacting the prefrontal cortex, the myelin sheath, in exactly the same way that substance addiction was. So we started seeing actual shrinkage in the DGM, the dense gray matter of our executive functioning, the part of our brain that controls our impulsivity and our decision making, in the same way that a chronic substance addict, they suffer from a double whammy. If you're a chronic heroin addict or alcoholic or cocaine addict, the more you use that substance, the more you compromise that part of your brain that allows you to make better decisions. So the more you use, you're going down that sort of vicious cycle of compromised decision making. So you're impaired in your decision making the longer you're under the influence. So now we found that screen time affects the DGM, the dense gray matter, in exactly the same way. It compromises that part of the brain that's really required for good decision making, and also impulsivity. And we know that impulsivity is the handmaiden of or the umbrella disorder for a lot of addictive disorders. Highly impulsive people tend to be more correlated with addiction. And then we also saw that it was doing damage to the white matter, the myelination, the insulation cable of our brains, the part of our neurons that connected with that white lipid, that really fragile white lipid called the myelin sheath. We saw that would begin to break down over extensive screen time. So it was this understanding that this wasn't just affecting people clinically, it was affecting people neurophysiologically to be primed that way. And then what does that lead to? Because now what I talk about a lot is, because it was, when you and I started talking about this years ago, we had to convince people that this was even habit forming. And now that's been asked and answered. But now it's what's the byproduct of the screen addiction? Now we're talking about increased suicide rates, higher levels of other kinds of impulse disorders like I think there's a direct correlation with our highly addicted young people and the fentanyl crisis and people with substance addictions and the mental health spikes that we're seeing, the suicide rates, the depression, anxiety. All of these are correlates of being compromised by our screen, addicted to our screens, whether it's gaming or social media. We have a more vulnerable, psychiatrically vulnerable group of young people.
Yeah, so you mentioned a lot of things that are happening in the brain, and a lot of it is no good. I mean, this is like really harmful, right? But why is it so hard for kids to stop when this is actually causing serious brain damage to them, causing them to have like delay in executive function, probably, struggling in school and all this? What is it about the digital games and digital technologies that is making them difficult for them to stop?
Well, again, we talk about that the prefrontal cortex or executive functioning doesn't fully develop till we're in our mid-20s. And another way, some neurologists will call the prefrontal cortex or executive functioning our brain's brakes, the braking mechanism. We all have impulsive tendencies to do certain things, and the part of our brain that says, maybe you shouldn't do that, what's called our consequential thinking, if we damage that developmentally, because again, that doesn't fully bloom until our mid-20s, but now we're throwing a wrench into the works, right? At ages 6, 7, 8, ages 3 years old, 10 years old, we're compromising the development of that part of the brain. So now we're having kids who are, let's call it impulse challenged, because we're creating really a profile of young people who are really impulse challenged. And so we're saying engage in this highly addictive behavior and only do it for 30 minutes. And then wondering why they can't stop. Well, they don't have the neurophysiological apparatus to stop. And so we're putting them in a lose-lose situation. If we're saying engage in this highly addictive experience, only do it for 20 minutes and then you'll get in trouble if you don't. So a big part of what I talk about is as much as possible to delay the exposure to this highly arousing, dopaminergic, adrenalergic platforms, because kids just aren't really hardwired yet to be able to handle that. In the same way that I say, driving a car is wonderful, but you don't give the car keys to a 7-year-old.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And, parents struggle with determining whether their kids are addicted or they have problematic use of technology or they have or healthy use of technology. So what do you recommend for parents to look for to distinguish between whether their kid's addicted or is this healthy?
Yeah, and I teach an addiction class where we talk about what's the difference between a hobby, a habit, and an addiction. When does my stamp collecting become an addiction? When does my stamp collecting hobby become, all-consuming and compulsive? And, and the main symptom, the main qualifier of an addictive disorder is it beginning to compromise your life, broadly speaking. There's all sorts of other DSM checklist criteria. But it's different for every child, right? Every child has a different, we talk about risk and protective factors. Some children have a little bit more ability to handle certain experiences. They have maybe a higher levels of resilience or whatever the case may be. And other children are much more vulnerable to less exposure. So because I always have parents asking me, should it be 2 hours of less of screen time, 1 hour, half an hour, 4 hours? And what I always say, it's really child specific. One child can handle 3-4 hours a day of screen time and the other child can't handle 30 minutes. So what you should begin to look for is how dysregulated does your child get post screen time? Do they have a hard time sort of landing after the plane touches down? And how is it affecting all the domains of their lives? Are their academics beginning to suffer? Are their interpersonal relationships beginning to suffer? And sleep dysregulation is a big one. Is Johnny or Susie staying up all night because they're online? Because you've spoke about this very powerfully. The price to pay is sleep, and so sleep deprivation and screen time go hand in hand. Now, I don't care if a parent or the kids that I work with are young adults. I don't care if we call it addiction. I don't care if we call it addiction or problem usage. But if it's creating a problem in your life by any other name, let's call it a problem, and then let's say, what do we need to do to help not cross the line to more severe types of issues where you need professional help and treatment. How do we prevent? How do we create a parenting style that helps support our kids so that they're optimizing their development rather than trying to fix a problem after the Johnny or Susie fall down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, those are good points. And so, with the research that we have now, we know that these platforms are addictive and that we know that basically they're designed to be addictive for the sake of profit. And so do you think that all that responsibility of setting those boundaries fall on the parents, or do you think that corporations also have responsibility too?
Well, so I know you and I are aligned with this too. I think the parents need to do their part, but I do think that we also need to kind of address it on the macro level too, where there's legislative initiatives and there's litigation, because at the end of the day, we have to kind of attack all sides. This is a societal problem, and we need to put some guardrails up where kids aren't being predatorily targeted either by social media algorithms or gaming companies that are targeting kids' vulnerabilities, because let's face it, kids are the vulnerable consumers. And then I think parents, unfortunately, were under-aware of these problems. What I've written about is I think parents of a certain generation, let's say our generation, conflated modern screens with television from yesteryear. And so they said, oh, I grew up on television. These are just small TV sets. What can be the harm? But these are not small TV sets. These are interactive and immersive in ways that television never were. They're ubiquitous in ways that television never were. They have predatory algorithms that television never had. And now there's AI also driving the bus. So these are really powerful forces out there. So we do have to attack from class action lawsuits similar to Big Tobacco and Purdue Pharmaceuticals and what we did with Big Pharma to put warning labels and guardrails. And then I think there's legislation, like, for example, Section 230 of the American Communications Decency Act. Big tech was not allowed to be sued because they were essentially saying that they weren't content publishers. They were just, innocent third-party message boards where other people were posting toxic content. And we have nothing to do with this. But in fact, they had a lot to do with the messaging posted on different content platforms because they were targeting who would get the messaging. So, I've been involved with some of the, in Florida, for example, they put some guardrails in from K through 12 to kids with social media, not having social media in schools, with Governor DeSantis signed that into law. About a year and a half ago, I had testified with the Florida state legislature talking about the harms of predatory social media. So I do think we can attack this at that level. And I think we have a strong voice as consumers and as parents if we come together, because for a long time the narrative had been, as you know, oh, well, this is just the way of the future. This is just the way things are going to be. And I'm just going to accept that schools are giving my kids tablets in preschool that I don't want them to have, or that the Kool-Aid that's being sold to us is that technology is somehow educational. That was the one that used to get to me. It's, parents, I think, felt really competitive with other parents that if Johnny or Susie didn't have a device by age, 3 minutes out of the womb, that somehow they were going to be behind in this arms race of digital, competency. So we're doing our job to raise awareness to say these are harmful devices. They're great for adults. We got to be careful with our kids because they are addictive by design. And the parents have to do what we can. And then if it does cross the line, then luckily now there's more available treatment and resources out there to help parents with these issues.
Yeah, and I want to emphasize to those who are watching that, this is such an important issue. And what Dr. Kardaras is trying to do is save the kids from permanent brain damage. And I'm not using that term loosely, and I'm not throwing it around. Seriously, if kids are playing hundreds of hours per week from the time that they are young, like 2 or 3 till they're 18, you will see severe brain damage. All the stuff that Dr. Kardaras has mentioned about the gray matter shrinking and also the executive functions in the brain are basically not developed. If the brain doesn't develop within the certain milestones that are necessary, it will be permanent brain damage for the rest of your child's life.
And Andy, some neurologists are calling it, as you know, digital dementia. It's looking like dementia. This, and I have a treatment program in Austin, Texas, where we treat 17 to 30-year-olds. I've had so many, we've treated over, 1,300 clients on the last 7-8 years. I mean, some of them come in, they look like they're catatonic. They look like they they are presenting as brain impaired. And they weren't that way before their screen over you. So you're clearly seeing them. One of the things that gets, I think, underappreciated, like there's other effects too, like, for example, creativity and being able to use active imagination. I've noticed when I work with young people who are 17, 18, and again, because I'm on the front lines treating this issue, so you're seeing some of these impacts. You mentioned developmental milestones. So we know that obviously like language is a developmental milestone, but also things like being able to focus and attend, our ADHD, our ability to attend is a developmental milestone, but also creativity. So they say one of the best things to do for infants and children neurosynaptically is to allow them to play make-believe, use their active imagination, and that creates neurosynaptic pathways of creativity. When I work with young people who have been on screen since 18 months, 2 years old, I could tell right away they have the blank stare, but they are not able to visualize. So I was running a group, you might find this interesting in your listeners. About 2 years ago, I was running a group at Omega Recovery in Austin, and they were all about 18, 19-year-old. They were college students who had failure to launch, flunked out because they couldn't leave their dorm room because they were stuck on their computers. And we were reading a passage, and the young man who was extremely bright, most of the gamers that I work with are extremely bright. He said, I can read, but I can't visualize it. I can't visualize what I read. I don't see it in the movie. The movie screen of my mind doesn't show what I'm reading. I can phoneticize. I can read the symbols. And then I asked the rest of the group, who else also has the same problem? And every hand went up. And then they tried to explain to me that when they read a book, they are not able to visualize it because that part of their brain that creates visual imagery apparently had atrophied or never developed. And so because they were used to getting external visual imagery from their gaming platforms or their other overly stimulating digital media, that their own ability to create visual imagery didn't seem to be there. I hadn't heard anyone talk about that before. And that was, to me, a shocking, little discussed side effect of what we're talking about.
This is the experiment that kind of describes what we're seeing clinically. You and I are describing. So decades ago, they had a monkey experiment where they literally had a monkey and they amputated one finger, okay? And they mapped out the areas of the brain that innervated all these fingers, and they found that the finger that got amputated, the adjacent fingers would take over the brain areas for this finger. And we see that all the time, like somebody who loses, like, let's say their sight when they're young, their hearing takes over, certain right. areas of the brain. And so we see that in vision too. If I don't correct vision in a child early on in their life, because let's say they had a lazy eye that's mm-hmm. out, this eye will literally get de-innervated by the visual cortex, and the adjacent columns literally will take over that eye that's mm-hmm. deviated out, and they actually will be blind for the rest of their life if they're not corrected by, let's say, age 12 or maybe 14 at the latest. But 14 is pretty much, their vision is very impaired. So this is what we're seeing. This is serious. By the way, I have that issue, by the way. It's interesting that you say that, because I was just to my eye doctor not too long ago. I had a nerve, retinal non-detachment issue when I was born in Athens, Greece. And I never... At that time, they didn't have the laser technology to correct it. So I'd been legally blind in my left eye because of a mechanical issue. It's called the Mittendorf dot. Right.
So in Athens, not able to correct it. And now apparently they can fix that mechanically. But I've been told by every ophthalmologist that it won't matter. You'll still be
you'll still be blind.
Because right. your brain never. And I said, really? We could put a man on the moon? We can't. My brain can't neuroplasticity. We can't adapt. But I was told exactly what you said with my own vision. And it's so interesting to hear you say that.
And this is why what you do is so essential. And that's why I bring people on like you who are the experts to try to emphasize the severity of this, the urgency of this, because every decade, and we've been doing this together for 2 decades now. So literally we've lost 20 years of youths from brain damage. And I'm saying brain damage because it is brain damage. And so I know people are going to push back and can't believe that screens are causing brain damage, but a Mittendorf dot is just a developmental abnormalities that put a opacity in your central vision enough to block your vision that your brain shut it off. So what the screens are doing is doing the same thing. You're actually occupying a child's mind with a screen, and as they're looking at that screen, they're actually letting other areas of their brain never develop.
Atrophy. And as you pointed out so accurately, and so now these are lifelong issues in the same way that a feral child who's not exposed to language is lifelong compromise. They could develop some basic, never idioms and metaphor. And so I think that's the important message, Andy, that we're trying to convey to families and the general public is these are lifelong consequences. And it's not just, I want us to kind of get away from like tech addiction and, it's every child is getting impacted. And then what I try to do is I try to really connect the dots with our spiking young adult adolescent mental health crisis and the intersection with screen time. Because there's a reason why as the generational cohorts get younger, so if you start at baby boomers, I don't know if I'm cusp baby boomer Gen X, so baby boomer Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, the younger the cohort, the higher the psychiatric metrics. So the worse rates of depression, anxiety, loneliness, self-harm, overdose. The loneliness epidemic that's affecting millennials, the most plugged in generation, the millennials are quote unquote the loneliest generation. They have the fewest friends. 25% of the millennials say that they don't have one friend. The healthiest generation are the baby boomers. Lowest rates of depression, most friends. And so we have to look at this correlation and causation by some of the research. The more plugged in you are to your screen, the price of admission is tech addiction, but now the depression, the anxiety, existential crisis. Now, if you're a young person who's doom scrolling and you think the world's ending in 5 years because everything's horrible because you're immersing yourself in this negative reinforcement. Now, and the other two things that we know drive depression, right? Being sedentary, right? Because physical activity is the best antidepressant and the best natural antidepressant. And we also know social connection. So now we've got this, and the experiment that confirmed all this was COVID. We had this brewing crisis pre-COVID in 2019 where all the mental health metrics for adolescents and young adults were going through the roof, and then COVID. So then COVID was an amplification of isolation, screen time, quarantines, screen dependence, and we saw all the depression rates and all the self-harm rates and all the suicide rates just went through the roof. So it was directly related to the world that we've chosen to create for our young people and for ourselves. We're just, the old timers like you and I are a little bit more immunized because, we're a little bit longer in the tooth. So we have some more, let's call them protective factors, but not totally. I've worked with 60-year-olds who struggled with screen time, but our younger folks are more vulnerable, as we both know. So that's really the cry, to the society is like, let's really pump the brakes here and be more intentional with what we're doing because this experiment is not turning out well.
No, and let's just throw my story out there. So I struggled with gaming addiction in medical school and during my residency, and I didn't sleep very much, and that's how I got through medical school and residency. And I went to Johns Hopkins Med School too, so one of the top schools.
Slacker.
I know, right? It's actually harder to get in now because it's completely free. Bloomberg gave them $1 billion in endowment. So
really?
Every single position there is a free ride. And wow. So instead of just being 90 percentile, everyone's the 99th percentile because it's free. But at Hopkins, for example, I was playing like 100 hours a week from the age of like 25 to about 35. So you count all those hours, about 20,000 hours total, which is a whole lot. My family suffered, my marriage suffered, but I was able to recover from that. Meaning that once I stopped, my brain was already developed. And you were talking about this. So as an old geezer like me who abused my brain for 20,000 hours, I recovered. I still have my speech and my language and my writing abilities. And I'm a full, staff at my hospital. And I'm very productive as an eye surgeon and in my field. And I'm a YouTuber and I'm doing all this stuff too. But if you take a child and gave them 20,000 hours of what I did over 10 years, their brain would not be the same because they're still developing. It's very different, right? Yeah. So when you talk to pediatricians, for example, they said, okay, if you're going to smoke marijuana, smoke it when you're an adult, like our age, right?
Right.
You're not going to fry your brain that much. But if you smoke it as a child, you'll fry your brain.
So your age was a protective factor. Plus, you also had some additional protective factors. You were well educated. You had family. You had other, in my world, we call them, risk versus protective factors. But if you were, not educated, living alone, working a minimum wage job, you may not have bounced back from your addiction to gaming. You may have continued to be swallowed up, but the fact that you've had some additional protective factors allowed you, I think, to be able to emerge from that and have the successful life that you've had. But and by the way, and I always love, I do share your story because people have stereotypes of gamers are like the pimply faced teenagers that, the basement dwellers that don't have a lot going on. And I point out to my friend, Dr. Doan, who was a Johns Hopkins resident who had all the bells and whistles and the successes, and yet still almost got swallowed up by the rabbit hole of gaming addiction and or other digital media. Now we could plug in there. So, so what chances does the 16-year-old who doesn't have those other things that you have? What these poor kids are, they're the low-hanging fruit or the fish in the barrel, whatever metaphor we want to use. These poor kids are just sitting ducks for being targeted by these really powerful companies.
Very powerful. And I'm not pointing out Fortnite. I just know the statistics for Fortnite, and that's why I'm throwing that out. Fortnite in 1 year, and after probably like almost a decade, is making 5 to 6 billion with a B annually. That is on a free game. That is how our kids are targeted, right? It's a free game. But I played Fortnite during the COVID pandemic. And just to mention, like these kids were all lonely, so they went online and played. And the way it works in Fortnite is that everyone buys these skins, right? So the Spider-Man skin or the Superman skin or the Star Wars skin, so Fortnite releases these costumes that you buy for like $10 to $20 for these things. And if you're a child and you join a group and you don't have the money, you will literally get booted out of the chat room, and they said, oh, boot the default, because they're using default clothing or default skins. And so they are literally bullied into begging for V-Bucks from their grandparents and their mom or dad or family to get the costumes or the skins. And once they found out that I was a doctor, because I'm pretty open about who I am, I'm like this 50-year-old guy playing games, they would start begging money from me or begging, me to buy them skins. So I had to stop, because I'm like, man, I did the math, and I'm like, man, there's like 100,000 kids in these chat rooms. I go broke after trying to buy all these skins because I feel bad for these kids. But that's how the peer pressure online is driving a huge one game to make $5 to $6 billion.
It's amazing. And the other I think the other tentacle now, because there's so many tentacles to this thing, right? As we know, the one that's getting to me now too is the online gambling, right? DraftKings, and we're getting so many of our young clients. Remember back in our day, now we sound like real old geezers now, but even 10 or 15 years ago, professional betting and professional sporting teams, there was a firewall between that. You weren't allowed to have gambling. Remember, it used to be Pete Rose couldn't get into the Hall of Fame because of his relationship with gambling. And now every commercial during the NFL, every commercial in the NBA is and you know what I found, Andy, that was really, I think, Orwellian language manipulation. They were showing commercial for online gambling, DraftKings or one of the other ones, and they said, if you develop a problem gaming, we'll call out to this number. They were beginning to now conflate. They weren't even calling it gambling. They were calling it gaming, because gaming was sort of like making it a little bit more innocuous, I think a little bit less threatening. And what I've seen now with some of these young kids, I think the gateway drug for gambling has become some of these fantasy leagues, right? And I've got teenage boys myself. And so they were beginning to get into some of these fantasy leagues. And then it was like, well, no, now you're in this fantasy league, but you get some prizes. But now if you bet on these players, but it starts off being non-cash, but then it morphs into this almost, I noticed with some of my kids' friends, they became almost stat obsessed in like almost like an spectrum-y kind of way, where now they weren't just watching the game for the game's sake anymore. Everything was about a parlay or this or that. And it was similar to game. So they were gaming, and then they were gambling, and then they were doing some porn, and it was all just mixing in there with all these instantly gratifying, highly impulsive digital activities that were all a mess, because these kids were just staying indoors now. They weren't playing sports anymore. there were e-athletes now. Now they were playing like League of Legends leagues, and rather than baseball or football. I know you had some experience with your son who became a track star, and I think that is one of the big antidotes, right? We talk about what are some of these antidotes. So it's like sports, real sports, not esports, music and creativity, and academics, and
so my son, he was had problematic play with gaming. We took away the games, and he became a Division I runner at University of Portland, and then eventually at Liberty University. And that's the antidote, was to take that away, and his creativity and his desire to perform in athletics increase. But you're absolutely right. This whole online gambling is ridiculous, because we do have a clinical diagnosis for problematic gambling. And so when you expose a huge populace that probably has genetic predisposition of about 10% gamblers that are problematic gamblers, when you expose the population, it's going to cause issues. It's going to cause
and you've primed these kids are now impulse compromised, because as we talked about before with the myelination and the prefrontal cortex. So they've already been compromised with their decision making, because we've seen the brain imaging research. So now you're taking decision compromised young people and exposing them to gambling platforms and thinking that it's not going to be an issue.
Yeah.
Or because they know it's going to be an issue. That's why they're targeting. That's why they're targeting these vulnerable kids, and they're trying to sort of sugar candy coat, not gambling, but it's gaming and the nonsense that I talked about before. It's just so insidious.
It's terrible. So you've helped thousands of teens break free from screen addiction and gambling addiction and all these other types of addictions. What is the successful intervention look like for these children?
Yeah, so again, I'll start off like, it's easier to prevent the problem than to treat it. So if you can, I talk about a healthy psychological immune system. If you can help engender a healthy psychological immune system for your child, and that means like, Angela Duckworth talked about grit, these ingredients of what can create a young child to be resilient. And ingredients that can help a healthy psychological immune system are critical thinking skills, creativity, all the balance activities that we talked about. Those can help immunize to some degree. Moral compass and some of those things I think are highly important. Any kid that is tethered to a sense of values that can help make their lives meaningful, because with any addiction, we know it can be existential escapism. The depressed person that feels the world is meaningless is more likely to lose themselves in a bottle or a syringe or a digital platform. So if somebody has a worldview, faith can be very important in that sense, or at least a paradigm where the world makes meaning and sense. So I talk about creating a philosopher warrior archetype for young people. So the philosopher embodies critical thinking and ethical discernment. The warrior embodies grit and resilience and stick-to-itivism, because so many of the young people that I've treated have no ability to regulate their emotions. They're all highly emotionally reactive. They are, it's the stereotype of the trigger warning safe space crowd. I'm teaching at a graduate school again I had taught for many years at graduate school, and I'm seeing this group of 23 to 28-year-old graduate students are part of that culture that we're talking about. They're much more vulnerable, emotional, reactive. And so that doesn't translate well. Potentially they're going to have a harder time transitioning into careers and into family lives. So it's trying to, I think, create the strong psychological system on the front end. And if a person starts falling down that rabbit hole, there is treatment. And now we start talking about digital detoxes and trying to reset and recalibrate oneself to be able to do that. But the challenging part becomes, I've run this treatment program for a long time now, is the reentry back into the real world. I mean, a young person could do great while they're in treatment because they're doing a digital detox for 6 weeks. So of course they're going to do wonderfully. How do they, so we call the digital reentry plan is the key. So what does that runway look like? We don't expect young people to be digitally abstinent. We don't expect them to go Amish. So how can you now use mindful use of technology? Can you identify, as our friend Dr. Hilary Cash talks about, digital vegetables versus digital candy? So Zooming grandma is a healthy use of technology, but maybe third rails that I need to avoid, my digital drugs of choice, as we say in my addiction world, I need to go abstinent. I can't, if I've developed a problem, the neurosynaptic pathways, snow tracks in the snow for, if I've became addicted to League of Legends or to World of Warcraft, I can't moderate that game even 10 years of abstinence later, because I'll go back to, my brain will light up in that same way because it's conditioned itself to respond to that. But I can do other things online. I can find other recreational, meaningful activities, both online and offline, and create a mindful digital world. And like any other addiction, you're less likely to relapse if you're feeling good about the trajectory of your real life. So I talk about the hero's journey. Many of our problematic gamers or social media folks, they are living vicariously through a digital fantasy world because their day-to-day lives or existence don't feel meaningful or don't feel palatable. So if you can help make your life the adventure, love what you're doing, love what you're studying, love the life that you're living, and create a life that's meaningful for you, you're less likely to be gravitationally pulled into the siren song, right, of some of these platforms. And it's not always easy. It takes time, and takes effort, and takes support from loved ones. And it's a difficult, I'd say it's more difficult to treat than heroin addiction, because we're swimming in it. Where, to be a heroin addict takes some effort to find heroin and dealers. And you could be you could live a very successful life being abstinent from heroin. But how do you swim in the ocean of digital when you've developed digital addictions that are all around us? That's what makes it really challenging.
Yeah, and that's why you came up with Omega Recovery and also Blue Light Health. How are those
phenomenal? Omega Recovery, we're one of only 2 or 3 treatment programs in the country that residentially treat young adults 17 to 30, 35. And it's a 6-week program. They do well. If you follow the aftercare recommendations, we've had amazing success. If at the end of the 6 weeks, the client thinks, okay, I could go back to gaming 2 hours a week or 2 hours a day, they don't do as well. So the key is to follow the aftercare recommendations. And the whole purpose of our soon-to-launch Blue Light Health is there are so few treatment options out there. One of the things that I discovered when I wrote Glow Kids in 2016, I got literally thousands of emails from families who were struggling with their teenagers' mental health and their screen time. And every time they would go to a therapist or a psychiatrist, they didn't understand the problem. They would say, well, just let the kid game. What's the big deal? They were so under-aware of the impact of the problem on their kids' mental health that they couldn't find meaningful help. So I've gone through a process where I created a training protocol for therapists who get certified in treating tech overuse issues for adolescents, and we're launching. It's essentially better help for teenagers, where you can get a therapist online, which is a healthy use of technology if you're getting some support. And we're using the clinical protocols that I developed in Austin. I developed some special sauce. There's a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of dialectical behavioral therapy, but there's also some things that I found really useful in treating tech addiction that we've baked into these protocols. And we're going to be launching Blue Light Health, this online platform, probably in about May. And we're hoping to make treatment available to the millions of families around the country who right now say, I can't find help and I don't want to put my kid in the hospital. Is there some kind of intervening treatment that I can get? And that's what we're hoping to do.
Oh, wow. That's exciting. I'm looking forward to that. And do you guys have a website yet?
Omega Recovery, of course, does. Blue Light, we're just about to launch the website in the next 3 to 4 weeks. But if people wanted to reach out to me directly, I can turn them on to that. My website is www.Kardaras, Kardaras.com. And so anybody interested in Blue Light Health can reach out to me there. And Omega Recovery is omegarecovery.org. If anyone watching is at the point where they need more of an intervention, more than maybe they can do at home or with a once-a-week therapist, as I like to say, a once-a-week therapist is good for a once-a-week problem. But if a young person has developed a lifestyle problem and they need a more significant shift in their lives and some more significant treatment, then going away to treatment has been life-saving for a lot of the young people that we've treated.
So, Dr. Kardaras, you've lived a fascinating life, okay? You were a karate champion, a nightclub owner, a coma survivor, and now a leader, obviously, in the addiction treatment and recovery. So how have your personal struggles shaped the way you helped others?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah. So, I lived an interesting life. I had, Ivy League school, but then I fell into some bad habits after college. I had my own existential crisis in my early 20s, and I was vulnerable for some of those temptations, and then back in my day, there weren't so many digital temptations, but they were substance related. So I developed a pretty severe addiction that I had to get into recovery over. And it was in that transformation of getting into recovery that, part of the mission statement of being in recovery is to help others. And, so going back to graduate school and getting my degrees to help other people, but it also made me sensitized to all types of struggles. And I became one of the first, one of the pioneers that saw, hey, wait a second, there's a new flavor of addiction out there that I don't think my colleagues are sensitized to. So being a recovering addict made me more sensitized to the telltale signs of addictions, other addictions as well. So I also understood the importance and the possibility of being able to overcome addictive struggles as well, and what some of those ingredients were. So I think my lived experience in that arena, just like your lived experience, makes you such an important voice in this. You're not just an academic or a clinician. Similarly, I've also paid the price of admission through my own lived experience. So that gives us, I think, an added layer of insight and understanding to the problem. And it also, from a societal level, it helped me to understand that when young people feel empty and lost, that's really the underlying issue. I talk about this with fentanyl all the time. We could look, and we should be locking down the borders with fentanyl, but you could eliminate all the fentanyl, at the border. We're looking at the telescope through the wrong end. Why have we created a society that makes young people feel empty and depressed and self-loathing in a way that they need to escape some of their own feelings and their own identities? That's what we really need to be focusing on, I believe. I believe that, right now there's, our young people are going through this crisis, and we're focusing on what they're self-medicating with rather than focusing on why they feel that way. And so it's a thing when we hear about the loneliness epidemic. Why are young people feeling lonely in record numbers, and how can we correct that? So maybe the challenge is, can we create genuine meaning and connection for our young people and not have the counterfeit connection through this digital avatar world that our kids are living in? So those are some of the lessons that I learned, I think, firsthand, and I'm trying to bring to this arena from a clinical and societal perspective.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your personal story there. And you're absolutely right. Our life experiences and struggles, with addiction. For you, it was substance. For me, it was tech addictions. It made it help give us insight. It gave us insight, give us understanding. We were able to recognize that this new video game addiction and screen addiction was a problem before other colleagues, could.
Oh, and can I make one? I forgot
Absolutely.
about the karate piece. For me, the martial arts, I studied very traditional Japanese karate since I was a kid growing up. And for me, that was one of my protective factors. And like a lot of games, I was leveling up. I was getting my belts. I was going from white belt, yellow, green, blue, purple, brown, black. And, you feel a sense of accomplishment. And this was my identity. And, I was a Bruce Lee fan. And I studied with a very traditional Japanese master. And through I competed competitively in the AAU in my college career. And all that gave me a sense of identity and a sense of purpose, a sense of leveling up. It was when I took a leave of absence from my martial arts career. There was some political infighting. I won't get into the details, but my sensei and the school, the dojo, had an issue, and a few of us took time away because they were going to sort out their own little political infighting at this type of martial arts, which I don't want to mention the names. During that leave of absence, I was 22, 23. In that void was when my other addictions filled that void. It's when I lost my tether to that thing that was giving me such a sense of purpose and connection. And that's when I really saw, wow, something like the martial arts or sports can be so important, but the loss of that can also create this chasm that bad habits can fill. So there was that piece as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And human beings are so multifaceted, and there's so many risk factors that can be considered when someone is struggling and having trouble. And it's interesting that you have that insight and able to share that with others too, that they can be helped by your story. I think that's awesome.
When I was running a treatment program for adult addiction in in the Hamptons in New York, and this was like very successful people who had fallen into addiction, whether it was pills or so many of them were some of them had been celebrities, some of them had been professional athletes, some of them had been hedge fund masters of the universe. But so many of them, when they fell into the addiction, was when they lost their professional career because they blew out an ACL, so they could no longer be an NFL player, or their hedge fund crashed and burned, or they were an actor who was no longer getting roles, and so they were suffering through a crisis of identity, and all of a sudden, the pill, the bottle, all the other feel goods snuck in because, and so I was working with people that were highly intelligent and successful, who were in their 40s and 50s and 60s, and were developing addictive problems because of losing that piece. And so, our 17 and 18 and 19-year-olds who haven't even fully developed the sense of, who am I in this world? What is my sense of purpose in this crazy world that we call the United States in 2025? So those are all relevant. Those are part of the treatment. We address those. What's going to be your hero's journey? What's going to be your life's adventure? What's going to give your life meaning? We're not just going to say depression bad. We're going to say what's underneath your depression, so we can work with that with you. And so you don't want to hopefully game obsessively, because you won't need to.
So within the last, I think, year or so, the WHO, the World Health Organization, classified in ICD-11 that gaming disorder is going to be a recognized disorder. Okay. United States still hasn't accepted that yet, but in preparation for that, what do you envision that needs to change in terms of treatment, insurance coverage, and policy change?
We've been using the ICD codes. The World Health Organization has the International Classification Disorders. The ICD-11 has internet gaming disorder on it as of last January, I think it was. And so technically, we're supposed to be able to use it because we're supposed to be, as state licensed treatment providers, we're supposed to use either DSM or ICD-11 codes. And so the insurance companies have been slow to accept that diagnosis, even though it's an official diagnosis. They're being slow to the dance. But I'm envisioning, as it becomes more time goes on and more prevalent, that it'll just grease the tracks to create access to treatment much more so. Because right now we currently have to use the comorbid diagnosis for insurance purposes. So we have to use the depression piece or the anxiety piece rather than the gaming piece, even though we'll write it down as the secondary issue or whatever as the comorbid diagnosis. But I would imagine that in the next 6 to 12 months, it's going to be a lot easier to be able to get treatment. The problem is there's not a lot of treatment programs that really understand some of the nuances that we talked about. So they might just treat it like gaming bad and just avoid it, just do abstinence. But you can't be abstinent from digital media. You have to understand how to. I analogize it clinically. It's very similar to treating an eating disorder. You can't be food abstinent. You have to learn how to develop a healthy self-concept before you develop a healthy relationship with food. Similarly, you have to do the same with, if you're struggling with digital media, you have to develop a healthy self-concept and then a balanced, healthy relationship with digital media, and identify which foods or digital foods you shouldn't be ingesting, which are okay to have, and then move forward from there.
Yeah, that's very good. And so for those parents that are struggling with a child, or they think their child is struggling with severe screen problems, what is the single most thing that you can recommend that they do that can actually start a different trajectory for their child?
I think kids respond well to information, data. Kids seem to glom onto it. So, a lot of my clients in treatment responded really well to The Social Dilemma when they saw that documentary, and they saw that these were let me back up. No teenager likes to be told what to do. Don't do this, don't do that. Kids reflexively push back on that, right? But then when I tell an 18-year-old, well, I'm not telling you what to do, but you know who is manipulating you and monetizing you and turning you out? It's big tech. It's the gaming companies. Oh, and look at this documentary called The Social Dilemma, where they pull back the curtain and the guys pulling the strings are giving you the playbook of how they've used you. And then I get the response of, hell no, I don't want to be manipulated like that. Well, then now here's what you can do to fight back in your own life. So I find that to be an effective tool to have parents talk openly and maybe show some of the kids some of the what's going on, rather than to prescriptively finger wag, which doesn't tend to work well. And then it's again delaying the onset of the screen, so it's engaging with your child in face-to-face things, playing board games together and going out in nature. Nature is the other biggest antidote. And just nurturing your child as much as you can, and being firm. If your school insists on giving your child a Chromebook in first grade, push back against the school. The school works for you. And tell your school's administrator, I don't want my child to have a Chromebook in first grade. There's no educational benefit to it. Show me one study that proves that there's any benefit to having a Chromebook in first grade or third grade or fifth grade. And so I encourage parents to find their voice, both in their school systems, because oftentimes the schools are the gatekeepers of digital bad stuff, and to nurture their kids' development in ways that can be most impactful. Parents respond to this anecdote too. A lot of parents have heard about Steve Jobs didn't let his kids have iPads, but what a lot of parents haven't heard is that Sergey Brin and Larry Page, the Google boys, were Montessori students. Jeff Bezos was a Montessori student. The most powerful brains in the tech world had really natural childhoods without a lot of technology. Their brains were allowed to develop organically, so then they could be innovators and all those wonderful things that I don't know if we could say Jeff Bezos has done wonderful things, but all the innovations that they've done in the world because their brains developed naturally. They didn't drop a developmental stunting device into the crib that would only stunt their development, like what we're doing. If you drop that tablet into the 18-month-old crib, you're going to be stunting that child's development.
Yeah, those are
harming them.
Great advice. I just love it. Your wisdom, and you're so, you're well spoken. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise, taking the time to be here, and helping others, and really appreciate all you're doing. You're just amazing. Thank you.
Dr. Doan, it's always a pleasure. Whatever I can do to be of help, and I know we've been locked arms in this cause together, and these other initiatives we also talked about. So continue doing what you're doing, spreading the message on YouTube and on digital platforms, because the message needs to be put out there, and no one better than you to do this. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you enjoyed our video, please make sure you like, share, and comment, and also hit the subscribe button so that you don't miss our future videos. Until next time, have a great day. Thank you.